Today, my wife and I are visiting Colonial Williamsburg, an amazing living history museum in Virginia that tells the early part of America's enduring story. Come along with me and my wife as we explore a history buff's paradise. That's coming up next.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you all today?
Doing quite well.
Excellent. This is an absolutely gorgeous day that we find here in the capital, is it not?
Mm-hmm.
We have few of them this time of year, so let us all enjoy it while we can. I was just commenting to my oldest son earlier that you can tell it's not summer yet because none of the gentlemen and ladies who have their townhouses here in the city have left yet. But as soon as it becomes hot, friends, although, would you not agree, if you had a home next to a river where it was cool all day, wouldn't you wish to go there instead of this in the middle of a city? I would agree too. If I had a house on the James or the York, I would go there too. And leave my children, but I dearly love them. Please do not assume that I do not love my children. I love each of them desperately. That was a knowing chuckle. For those of you who are not familiar with me, I should make a proper introduction before I continue to tell you about my rascals that live within my house. My name is Clementina Rind, your humble servant. As you've noticed, I am a mother, but I also have the honor of owning one of the newspapers here within the city. I say honor, it is a trouble some days. It is a duty the other days, and a delight some days as well. But I also have the honor and the responsibility, and when I say honor, I do truly mean it by honor and a responsibility, of also being public printer to this colony. If you're not familiar with terms of printing, to be public printer means that you are charged with printing quite literally all of the public documents that come either from the gentlemen of the House of Burgesses, from the General Court, from the County Court here in Williamsburg, from the Governor and his council, truly quite anything you can imagine. Legislature, law, new bills of lading, taxes, militia bills, etc., etc., etc. But it is separate, friends, mind you, from my private business as owner of a newspaper and also as owner of a press. So when you think of myself as both public printer but also mistress of a newspaper, please, I would encourage you to think of them differently, separate, because they are, even though they are connected. And then there are my children. I have 4 of them, as I mentioned. My eldest is 11. My youngest is just turned 3. Sweet girl. And 3 boys, 1 girl. The girl is at the end. She is my reward for having made it through the rest of them. Although, this morning, friends, I will simply say this. I think all of my children conspired against me this morning because my youngest, too, decided that it was most appropriate to wake up feeling ill. But I will not say anything else. And unfortunately, it is one of those times, one of those days where it has been difficult because a great deal of the gentlemen burgesses and a great deal of the men of government and the men of business are within the city, this being the spring now of this new year of 1774. Friends, do you mind if I sit? Thank you. I appreciate it. And even though this is Sunday, I found myself with so much to do today that I could not take myself to church as much as I might wanted to. There was just too many other things to attend to. Part of it is the acknowledgement that the petition for public printer, of course, is coming up once again very shortly. But there's also a great deal of other government business that I think many of us are hoping is accomplished sooner rather than later, given the amount of rumor and disagreement that is swirling not only within our Capitol building, but I would say within the entirety of Virginia, in regards, of course, to Parliament. I do not know if you have heard, friends, for we have only recently heard in the past few weeks ourselves here in Virginia, of Parliament's reaction to the men of Boston. Do you know of what I speak? Last December, about 120 odd men destroyed property by throwing tea into the harbor of Boston. Have you heard of this?
Mm-hmm.
If you have not, I have an excellent newspaper you can subscribe to. That was subtle, wasn't it? Thank you. So we, I think, in Virginia have been hoping beyond hope that Parliament would simply acknowledge it for what it was, once more Bostonians being Bostonians. It is within their nature to riot, it is within their nature to be hot-headed. And how many times have the Bostonians done something and we've all gone up and simply moved on with our lives? That has happened time and time again. But apparently Parliament this time has decided that this is not within the realm of possibility for themselves. And they have decided, friends, to blockade the port of Boston. Not only blockade it by sending His Majesty's ships, but also sending far more troops than are even posted to this very moment to Boston. So one might say that it is both a closure of a port, but also an occupation, which I think many would argue is what one does to an enemy. It is almost as if they are treating Boston as it is France, because that is what you do to enemies. You blockade their ports and you oppress them with troops. I think many of us had hoped that Parliament had just ignored Boston and Boston would have settled and the difficulties would have gone by and men of calmer sense and wiser tongues would have won the day. Now, I'm not arguing, friends, please understand that Parliament is in their rights. They are not. They have overstepped them for the past 10 years. Would you not agree? I know many pin the beginning of our troubles currently with the start of the Stamp Act back in '65, and trust me, as being married to a printer even then, those were difficult days, I think, for all of us, specifically if you were a printer. But I do not think it started then. I think it started earlier. We just did not notice that Parliament was slowly stepping upon our rights as subjects of the Crown. Which is, of course, intolerable, is it not? That was not a rhetorical question, friends. It is intolerable. The fact that we, who are members of the freest society in the entire world, as subjects of the Crown, we are born with certain rights, are we not?
Indeed.
Yes, with certain liberties. These are instituted not only within the natural law, but within the law of society as well. It is something that cannot be ignored. And yet our Parliament, who is meant to safeguard us, not to represent us, because we have no representation in Parliament, but Parliament is meant to safeguard us, both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. They have simply decided, for whatever reason, and we could debate until Judgment Day, friends, upon why they have decided to do this, and I think all of us would probably be right. There is that many reasons. But they have decided to overstep their bounds and treat us as if we are not subjects of His Majesty the King, heirs to the same rights and liberties that they are, because we are simply separated by an ocean. Sometimes I wish I could speak to Parliament like I speak to my 4-year-old. Although I don't think they would listen. Parliament, not the 4-year-old. He listens quite well, most days. But it is concerning, friends, to myself, because I watch both as a subject of His Majesty, and therefore I'm grieved by how His Parliament is acting. But also I watch concerned good neighbors as a businesswoman, as the owner of a trade here within the city. I think sometimes it is hard for people to glimpse a newspaper and understand it as not what it seems. Well, I think most people look at a newspaper and think it a public good, yes? Of public access. But when in true fact, friends, it is a trade. Just as your carpenter, just as your shoemaker, just as your tailor, your mantua maker, that you go and purchase all of the things that are necessary for your life. It is still a trade. And it is still how I make a living. And I am the sole support for my children. For those of you who are not familiar with Virginia and her people, you perhaps are not aware that last August my husband passed away after an illness of some kind. and I miss him very much. What that means to the public eye is not only has our business fallen solidly to myself, but our children also now have just me as their support. But not just my children, my entire household. I have a journeyman who relies upon me in my trade, my business, and I have my property, both real and material. So in point of fact, I have 7 souls who depend upon me, as well as everything else. So when I look at Parliament and I see what they are attempting to do by the crushing of our rights and liberties, even though they are doing it to Boston, and who really cares about Massachusetts? I'm showing my Virginian stripes there. All of us will agree. Are there any men from Massachusetts here? No? So I can say whatever I wish? Excellent. All of us wish Massachusetts would just fall into the sea, do we not? It would solve so many of our difficulties if they would just disappear entirely. But unfortunately, I am not a woman of science nor a woman of geography, but I understand that it probably is not going to happen anytime soon. So we are stuck with Massachusetts. Unfortunately. But the trouble is, friends, is that if so easily Parliament can blockade Boston, what will it take for them to do it to another city, say New York, or say Virginia? Because with Virginia, you only need to blockade the Chesapeake Bay, and you do not make one city suffer, you make the entire colony suffer. It is almost comical to me that we could even be sitting here in broad daylight on such a fine afternoon and be discussing this fact that our Parliament might even consider to blockade the Chesapeake. Is that not? It is almost comical. And I think if you had asked me 10 years ago, friends, when I was still living in Annapolis with my husband and one small child and firmly established with the Maryland Gazette, if you had ever asked me, Mrs. Rind, here is the situation, do you believe it? I probably would have laughed in your face. Would not we all have? And yet here we find ourselves, a mere, not even 10 years later. Virginia is going to have to say something. The gentlemen burgesses, when they finally gather to attend to all of their business, they are going to have to decide upon some sort of gesture, upon some sort of statement to remind Parliament that it is not simply Massachusetts that they are attempting to curtail, but it is also the rest of us, as much as we do not wish to throw our lot in Massachusetts. You see, we are the largest colony. When Virginia speaks, everyone tends to listen. Where Virginia leads, the rest of the colonies follow. However, the gentlemen who make the decisions within that House of Burgesses, the 100 and odd of them who represent us, they will be the men making the decisions. They will, however, not necessarily be the men who must live out these decisions. And this is when I must remind you that once again, even though I own a newspaper, it is still a trade. The easiest way, of course, to retaliate against Parliament we have done before, and that is through a non-importation agreement. Recently, in years past, it has been against very specific things. Things such as tea, things such as fine silks, china, a variety of things. And it works quite well. For if you put pressure upon English merchants, we, after all, the colonies are English merchants' largest import. Without us, they would nowhere near make as much money. So if you put pressure upon English merchants will put pressure upon Parliament. Parliament will do whatever they wish. And so we go back to our normal way of pursuing it. It has worked well in the past. Both in 69, 70, and 71, there were very successful non-importation agreements against certain acts that Parliament had passed. So it works. Only trouble with non-importation agreements is that you have to stop importing things. And I'm not speaking of things that we might consider luxuries, that all of us might consider a luxury. Perhaps we can go without good port for 6 months. No longer than 6 months, let us be reasonable. But what if the gentlemen burgesses say, in order to make our opinion boldly known before Parliament, we should stop importing everything from Great Britain? Everything. Neighbors, if your households are just like mine, most, I would say 90% of everything that makes up your household is most likely imported from England. The pins that are holding my garment together were made and imported from England. The shoes upon my feet, even though we have fine shoemakers here within the city, it was cheaper for me to import them from a shop in London. You see fellow tradespeople in England make less wages than we do here within the colonies. They are also taxed much higher than we are here within the colonies. So it is cheaper to import. But there's a few other things that are vital to myself that are also not manufactured with any regularity here within the colonies, and that is paper, ink, and type. You see the difficulty there, sir. And while I agree with our gentlemen burgesses that we must say something, I am also struggling, friends, with the idea of how far do I agree to the detriment of myself. And yet, I am constantly reminded of my children, who are the most important thing within my entire life. And the one thing that I find most important is that when I was born in 1740, I was born with the right that is inherited by all freeborn subjects of His Majesty the King, God save him. And that is the right to English liberty. That is the right to breathe free air as a subject of the King. As the great philosopher Dr. Locke would put it, that we within English society have the right to our lives, to our liberty, and to the acquisition of property. That is what is given to us as subjects of the crown, and how dare Parliament, how dare they assume that they can ignore hundreds of years of English common law. The very documents that make up our English Constitution, even the Magna Carta itself, how dare they place themselves so high? There's one thing, friends, is there not? That you should never attempt to stand between an Englishman and their liberty. I find, friends, that there may not be any good outcome to all of this. Certainly people will be disappointed no matter what. That is a fact of life, yes? Something I tell my children constantly. You will never get everything you wish. I am dreadfully sorry. When you stop paying taxes, you will also never get anything you wish. But it is a fact of life. What I hope, though, friends, is that there can be at least some good compromise carried out. And that His Majesty the King would remind his Parliament of their duty and their responsibility. Forgive me, though, I'm airing out a very bad habit of mine, and that is the habit of going on without ceasing speaking. You will forgive me. I think that it comes down to being a printer, you understand. You find an open space, you put words into it. At least that is what I tell my children. But I spoke at the beginning of having a conversation, and conversations involve more than one people speaking. So I'm going to turn the conversation to you, friends. If you have curiosities or questions or things you wish to discuss, we may speak of anything. The weather, Williamsburg, the politics that we find ourselves in, myself. Or we can sit in silence as the Quakers do. I have no mind. Anything, friends. Yes?
Is there anything that you will not print in your paper?
Is there anything that I will not print in my paper? Are you asking for a reason, sir?
Yes.
Ah, well, do inform me of it.
Well, I was just wondering if even if they paid for it, you would not print it.
Ah, well, I will make known here, correctly, sir, which I have put within the pages of my newspaper often, is that even if you add money to whatever you wish to have printed, it will still not give it equal weight, more weight in my mind. In fact, and you might be bringing this to your mind, sir, but a few months ago, a gentleman decided that he wished something printed within the newspaper. An opinion, not an advertisement. Advertisement is something entirely different. Everyone understands you pay to put advertisements in the newspaper. But this was a matter of opinion. And he added, I forget, a few shillings in with it. And I made certain to publish within the newspaper that, first of all, this gentleman had done so. Secondly, he could come and pick his money up whenever he wished, because it did not change my mind in any sort of way. But that is true to all of you. Money, sir, comes to me from subscriptions and from advertisements, not from someone wishing to have something published within the newspaper. So yes, I do have rules and regulations, and the two that are first and foremost is one, is it of interest to my readers? Because if it is not, then no one will want to read it, and perhaps you next year will not subscribe to my newspaper, which, again, has a terrible effect upon my livelihood. The second is that it must be written well. And when I say written well, it must be something that you can understand, and something that is an engaging piece for anyone who might wish to read it. I think all of you understand, yes, that what you expect from your newspapers, and this is what fellow printers up and down the colonies and to England and for the most part the rest of the world understand as well, is what you all wish, is that you wish a newspaper that is filled with opinions. That is what most of the content is. A little bit of information from the world in general, but most of it is letters of opinions about politics, about philosophy, about religion, about gardening. You have never seen an argument until you have seen two Virginia gentlemen arguing about gardens. And so there's a variety of opinion. And so those are the two things that usually check. And then, of course, there's also my opinion of whether or not it ought to belong in a newspaper. There are certain things that I do not believe belong in a newspaper. For instance, if someone was attempting to sway the public at large in the matter of a court case, that belongs in the court, not within my newspaper. It is an interesting balance when you are choosing what to place within your press. In fact, the motto of my newspaper, if any of you have ever read it, is one that my husband and I discussed when we first arrived here in Williamsburg, and chose it for a purpose. And that is to be open to all parties, but influenced by none. Good motto, yes? Mm-hmm. You would buy that newspaper. See, it's worked. But there is something difficult about that motto as well. For when you say open to all parties, but influenced by none, you must also include yourself in the none. So therefore, when I lay out the broad pages of my newspaper, it must also not be influenced by me. Which is why, good neighbors, if you ever see my own words within my paper, they are usually within italics. So you know it is my voice and what's not. Does that answer your question, sir? Excellent. Yes?
Two questions. Can you talk about slavery in Williamsburg?
Certainly.
And second question is, what is it like to be a woman as a business owner in this city? Are there many, or do you face a lot of discrimination?
Certainly. Those fascinating questions, and I think in part they actually go a bit hand in hand. I can speak to you broadly of my own household. I own two people, my man Dick and my cook. My man Dick is mostly trained to the press. And I think you will find within the city specifically, there are a great deal of people who are property, who are also trained in some sort of skill, whether they be partly trained in a trade or something else, laundry, etc. I say specifically here within the city because it is a more concentration of tradespeople and business people than you will find out in the larger parts. So both my man Dick and my cook have been with my family for quite some time. Both of them have been, well, my cook was mine before I married my husband. And my husband owned Dick before he married me, so they have been with us for quite some time. And as I said, Dick is an integral part of my business. I could not function the newspaper without him. He is what is commonly referred to as a pressman. So when you actually go to pull the newspaper itself, there is someone who must quite literally pull the press and for the compression of the bar. It is an intricate dance done between two people of lifting and laying the papers and making sure everything is set. So I leave it to Mr. Pinckney and Dick. They are much better at it than myself. But I also make note, sir, that most newspapers across all of the colonies are pulled by men who are property. It is cheaper that way. And I think that is something that you must remember, sir, when you think of those who are our property, is that in many ways it is because it is cheaper to own someone and receive the benefit of their labor than it is to pay someone a wage to do so. It is part of our society. And I think there are men who are far wiser and better than myself who have had great philosophical discussions about it, but they themselves do not even know how to disengage it. And if they, who make far more money than I, do not know how to remove themselves of it, how can I even imagine losing the help of my people? Because I cannot afford to pay another journeyman. I could not afford to keep a maidservant who I paid. So it is a conundrum. I think also in the past 20 or 30 years, we have received more instruction from our church. There was a great debate some 40 years ago, some of you may even remember it, whether those who are called Negroes have souls or not. There was a great debate because if you do not have a soul, can you be one to Christ? That was the question. And it has been settled by most of the Anglican faith, which is the church that most Virginians belong to, that of course our Negroes do have souls. So therefore, one, you must treat them as if they do have souls. But you must also understand that it is responsibility of example. I imagine all of you have heard, and perhaps even wish to ask, well, Mrs. Rind, are you a kind mistress? I have been asked this question before, and I think it an interesting question, because I do not think I can answer that. It is oftentimes what I think to myself, am I a good parent? Well, I cannot answer that question. What I can say is that my people have souls. They have been part of my family since before my children were born. I cannot maintain my household without them, but they are still my property. And if it came down to it, I would sell them within a blink of an eye if I needed to. I hope that answers your question. Williamsburg at large is much different from Williamsburg in general. So there's a great deal more people here who maintain domestic households and tradesmen's households than there are those who work the fields here within the city at large. But you also make mention of myself as a woman. I think very interesting that you point that out. And specifically asking of how many women within the city of Williamsburg. I would say if we were together, all the tradespeople and all the business people under one roof, say at the Raleigh in the Apollo Room, and took what do the men of mathematics call it? Statistic. I would say a good 30% of the owners of businesses here in Williamsburg are women, both married or single or widowed, like myself. I think all of us understand that if you are not born to privilege, you are born to work, yes? Doesn't matter who the hands are attached to, male or female. If you're not born to privilege, you must work in some way. And so I think it is a simple understanding in our world that there's a great deal to be done, and all hands must work to accomplish it. So as far as that concerns, I have never, at least, been told to my face that someone is displeased with me owning a newspaper. Perhaps someone has that opinion, I do not know. If you've heard that, sir, I would beg you answer that later, perhaps in private, so we need not spread everyone's business to everyone. I will grant you, printing is not the most common trait for women to fall into it. I will also tell you that I did not decide to become a printer. I lost my heart to one. And that is the way of it sometimes, is it not? I think if you had asked me when I was young, I did not wish to have anything to do with printing, as much as I loved words in of itself. But I fell in love with the printer. And what happens is that the household and the business cannot stay separate. They must become united. Because if they do not become united, both of them will fall. It is like the very intricate working of a clock. You must be able to work that clock very, very well and carefully. Forgive me. So, does that answer your question, sir?
Yep.
Excellent. As I said, I can go on quite long. Anything else, friends? Yes, sir.
You mentioned you were one of the printers in Williamsburg. How many were there? And how did you fit in there? Were you number one, number two as far as subscriptions?
An honest question. The gentleman asks, he makes note that I mentioned I was one of the printers. It is true. There are currently one other press. And why I say currently is because the two gentlemen who own it together do not see eye to eye. And I foretell that within the next 6 months, at the very least, there will be a split between the two of them. And I think we will have 3 newspapers printing out of Williamsburg rather than just 2. And when I say Williamsburg, I mean the entirety of Virginia. There's just the 2 papers in the entirety of the colony. There is discussion of someone starting a paper down in Norfolk, but we shall see if that happens or not. Mr. Purdy and Mr. Dixon do not see eye to eye, because I think Mr. Dixon is a much more reserved, careful gentleman of much greater years than Mr. Purdy is. Mr. Purdy is quite young and rather hot-headed. He is a Scot, so I think sometimes that perhaps adds to it. But I think Mr. Purdy is also very keen on gaining the favor of the gentlemen of the House of Burgesses any way he can. Even if that is perhaps publishing views that are not quite his own, but would put him in greater favor. I do not wish to speak ill of a fellow printer, you understand, but some of his choices would not be the choices I make. Now, as far as who has more subscribers, sir, I do not know, because Mr. Purdy and Mr. Dixon will not tell me how many subscribers they have, and I will not tell them how many I have. I can always use more, mind you, and I'm sure they would say the same. I would say that we are both doing well for ourselves, but only one of us is public printer. I should go back to being humble now, shouldn't I? Thank you for your question, sir. Anything else, friends? Yes, madam.
If you don't mind, how did you and your husband meet?
Oh, I do not mind at all. The question is how my husband and I met. I am overjoyed to think of that time, because it was wonderful and strange, but wonderful. Love is strange, is it not, friends? Let us just acknowledge that fact. As I mentioned, I did not necessarily intend to fall in love with a printer. We were in Annapolis at that time. He had just come out of his apprenticeship. So he was apprenticed to Mr. Jonas Green of the Maryland Gazette. I was living in Annapolis, having come over in '55. It was meant to be with my father, but I lost my father on the voyage here from London. And so I found myself quite the orphan here within a colony that I was not at all familiar with. So establishing myself long before I felt I ought to. And I believe I was just over my majority, so 10 and 8, just over my majority when Mrs. Green, obviously Mr. Green's wife, a good friend of mine, still to this very day, said, Miss Rind, or Miss Van Grierson, I was at that time, Miss Van Grierson, why don't you come to our house this evening? We're having a small gathering. And I said, of course, Mrs. Green. And so I went, and there was some dancing to be had. And how my husband used to tell it, friends, is that he looked across the room great storyteller that he was, he looked across the room and he beheld the most beautiful vision upon earth. Yes, isn't it sweet? And he walked to said vision and asked her to dance, and she said yes. They danced not one set, but two sets together. And he left that room knowing that he had met the future partner of his life. I have no recollection of that night, nor of him. But apparently that is when he decided that there would be no other for him. And the time I actually do remember meeting him is once again in the Green's parlor. And Mrs. Green introduced me to their just newly minted journeyman. And I looked at him and I thought, my goodness, what a mop of curly hair that boy has. But we began to talk. And as it is, I think we found in each other a love of words, a love of natural philosophy, flowers, things that draw one together, and the desire to walk the path of the world. And when he finally asked me for my hand, I said yes. We were married in 62, a few years after we had met. And I told him 3 days after our wedding that I would have nothing to do with his press. But that was the folly of youth. I thank you for asking that. It brings good thoughts to mind. He was a remarkable man, and Virginia, I know, mourns him alongside with me. Friends, I do not wish to keep you too long. I know that there's a great deal of other business to attend to here within the city. And also, if we sit here too long, the sun will bake all of us. But I thank you very much for your conversation and your kind words and our variety of discussion, which had nothing to do, I might add, friends, with blocks or frogs or who stole the other one's stockings today, which has been absolutely delightful. I would encourage you, though, friends, since we have spoken a great deal, we do not know what will happen the rest of this year of 1774. Truly, none of us know what Parliament will do or what our gentlemen burgesses will do. But one thing I am made mindful of as I speak to my fellow tradespeople here within the city is that we must all continue to rely upon each other, yes? And it does not matter in what, politics, religion, philosophy, gardening, we must still rely upon each other, one individual to another. So friends, I hope you enjoy your visit here within the capital city. You enjoy the rest of your day. I'm your humble servant, Mrs. Rind.
Well, that's a wrap for this Colonial Williamsburg video. I hope you really enjoyed it, getting to see another part of this amazing living history museum. If you like this sort of stuff, check out my other videos. Check out colonialwilliamsburg.org to plan your own visit here, because it's so much cooler in real life than it is on film. Till next time, this is History Buff, Tina Photobug signing out, and I'm having a blast with the past.